and these he had given to Lucia on the occasion of 4 successive birthdays. He did portraits as well in pastel. These were of 2 types: elderly ladies in lace caps with a row of pearls, and boys in cricket shirts with their sleeves rolled up. He was not very good at eyes, so his sitters always were looking down, but he was excellent at smiles, and the old ladies smiled patiently and sweetly, and the boys gaily. But his finest accomplishment was needlework, and his house was full of the creations of his needle: wool work, curtains, petit point, chair seats, and silk embroideries framed and glazed. Next to Lucia he was the hardest worked inhabitant of Riseholme, but not being so strong as the Queen, he had often to go away for little rests by the seaside. Travelling by train fussed him a good deal, for he might not be able to get a corner seat, or somebody with a pipe or a baby might get into his carriage, or the porter might be rough with his luggage, so he always went in his car to some neighbouring watering place where they knew him. Dicky, his handsome young chauffeur, drove him, and by Dicky's side sat Foljambe, his very pretty parlour maid, who valeted him. If Dicky took the wrong turn, his master called "Naughty boy" through the tube, and Foljambe smiled respectfully. For the month of August his 2 plain strapping sisters, Hermione and Ursula, alas, always came to stay with him. They liked pigs and dogs and otter hunting and mutton chops, and were rather a discordant element in Riseholme. But Georgie had a kind heart, and never even debated whether he should ask Hermy and Ursy or not, though he had to do a great deal of tidying up after they had gone. There was always a playful touch between the meetings of these 2, when either of them had been away from Riseholme, that very prettily concealed the depth of Georgie's supposed devotion. And when she came out into the garden where her cavalier and her husband were waiting for their tea under the pergola, Georgie jumped up very nimbly and took a few chassee steps towards her, with both hands outstretched in welcome. She caught at his humour, made him a curtsy, and the next moment they were treading a little improvised minuet together, with hands held high and pointed toes. Georgie had very small feet, and it was a really elegant toe that he pointed, encased in cloth-topped boots. He had on a suit of fresh white flannels, and over his shoulder, for fear of the evening air being chilly after this hot day, he had a little cape of military cut, like those in which young ladies at music-halls enact the part of colonels. He had a straw hat on with a blue riband, a pink shirt and a red tie, rather loose and billowy. His face was pink and round, with blue eyes, a short nose, and very red lips. An almost complete absence of eyebrow was made up for by a firm little brown moustache, clipped very short and brushed upwards at its extremities. Contrary to expectation, he was quite tall and fitted very neatly into his clothes. The dance came to an end with a low curtsy on Lucia's part, and a obeisance hat in hand from Georgie, this exposure showing a crop of hair grown on one side of his head and brushed smoothly over the top until it joined the hair on the other side, and a clapping of the hands from Peppino. "Bravo, bravo!" he cried from the tea-table. "Capital!" Mrs Lucas blew him a kiss in acknowledgment of this compliment, and smiled at her partner. "Amico," she said, "it is nice to see you again. How goes it?" "Va bene," said Georgie, to show he could talk Italian too. "Va very bene, now that you've come back." "Grazie. Now tell us all the news. We'll have a good gossip." Georgie's face beamed with solemn gladness at the word, like a drunkard's when brandy is mentioned. "Where shall we begin?" he said. "Such a lot to tell you. I think we must begin with a great bit of news, something really mysterious." Lucia smiled inwardly. She felt that she knew for dead certain what the mysterious news was, and also that she knew far more about it than Georgie. This superiority she completely concealed. Nobody could have guessed it. "Presto, presto," she said. "You excite me." "Yesterday morning I was in Rush's," said Georgie, "seeing about some creme de menthe, which ought to have been sent the day before. Rush is very negligent sometimes, and I was just saying a sharp word about it when suddenly I saw that Rush was not attending at all, but was looking at something behind my back, and so I looked round. Guess. "Don't be tantalizing, amico," she said. "How can I guess? A pink elephant with blue spots? No, guess again." "A red Indian in full war paint." "Certainly not. Guess again," said Georgie, with a little sigh of relief. It would have been awful if she had guessed. At this moment Peppino suddenly became aware that Lucia had guessed and was up to some game. "Give me your hand, Georgie," she said, "and look at me. I'm going to read your thoughts. Think of what you saw when you turned round." She took his hand and pressed it to her forehead, closing her eyes. "But I do seem to see an Indian," she said. "Ah, not red Indian. Other Indian, and he has slippers on and brown stockings. No, not brown stockings, it's legs, and there's a beard and a turban." She gave a sigh. "That's all I can see," she said. "My dear, you're marvellous," said he. "You're quite right." A slight bubbling sound came from Peppino, and Georgie began to suspect. "I believe you've seen him," he said. "How tarsome you are." When they had all laughed a great deal, and Georgie had been assured that Lucia really, word of honour, had no idea what happened next, the narrative was resumed. So there stood the Indian, bowing and salaaming most politely, and when Rush had promised me he could send my creme de menthe that very morning, I just looked through a wine list for a moment, and the Indian, with quantities more bows, came up to the counter and said, "If you will have the great goodness to give me a little brandy bottle." So Rush gave it him, and instead of paying for it, what do you think he said? Guess. Mrs Lucas rose with the air of Lady Macbeth and pointed her finger at Georgie. He said, "Put it down to Mrs Quantock's account," she hissed. Of course the explanation came now, and Lucia told the two men the contents of Mrs Quantock's letter. With that her cards were on the table, and though the fact of the Brahmin from Benares was news to Georgie, he had got many interesting things to tell her, for his house adjoined Mrs Quantock's, and there were plenty of things which Mrs Quantock had not mentioned in her letter, so that Georgie was soon in the position of informant again. His windows overlooked Mrs Quantock's garden, and since he could not keep his eyes shut all day, it followed that the happenings there were quite common property. Indeed, that was a general rule in Riseholme. Anyone in an adjoining property could say, "What an exciting game of lawn tennis you had this afternoon," having followed it from his bedroom. That was part of the charm of Riseholme. It was as if it contained just one happy family with common interests and pursuits. What happened in the house was a more private matter, and Mrs Quantock, for instance, would never look from the rising ground at the end of her garden into Georgie's dining room. Or if she did, she would never tell anyone how many places were laid at table on that particular day when she had asked if he could give her lunch, and he had replied that to his great regret his table was full. But nobody could help seeing into gardens from back windows. The view belonged to everybody. Georgie had had wonderful views. That very day, he said, soon after lunch, I was looking for a letter I thought I had left in my bedroom, and happening to glance out, I saw the Indian sitting under Mrs Quantock's pear tree. He was swaying a little backwards and forwards. "The brandy," said Lucia excitedly. "He has his meals in his own room." "No, amica, it was not the brandy. In fact, I don't suppose the brandy had gone to Mrs Quantock's then, for he did not take it from Rush's, but asked that it should be sent." He paused a moment. "Or did he take it away? I declare I can't remember. But anyhow, when he swayed backwards and forwards he wasn't drunk, for presently he stood on one leg and crooked the other behind it, and remained there with his hands up as if he was praying for quite a long time without swaying at all. So he couldn't have been tipsy. And then he sat down again and took off his slippers and held his toes with one hand, while his legs were quite straight out, and put his other hand round behind his head and grasped his other ear with it. I tried to do it on my bedroom floor, but I couldn't get near it. Then he sat up again and called 'Chela, Chela,' and Mrs Quantock came running out." "Why did he say Chela?" asked Lucia. "I wondered too, but I knew I had some clue to it, so I looked through some books by Rudyard Kipling, and found that Chela meant disciple. What you have told me just now about Guru being teacher seems to piece the whole thing together." "And what did Daisy do?" asked Mrs